Yes.
Good. Okay, so good morning, everyone. My name is Anton Buerta. It's my pleasure to be hosting the seminar today. It is the fifth. Is it the fifth one, Andrea? Yeah, it should be the fifth one in our series on grappling with complexity. Today, we are fortunate to have one of our facilitators who will be leading today's talk. Everybody knows Andrea, so I'm not going to spend a great deal of time introducing her, but just to say that she's a professor of philosophy at the Nelson Mandela University and currently a holder of the Shachi Chair in Identities and Social Cohesion in Africa. And Andrea's done a lot of work in philosophy on Derridian complexity thinking, Lacanian psychoanalysis, and lots of thinking around just practical philosophy. Andrea and my history goes back now probably, geez, Andrea, 15 years. I was one of Andrea's students. She certainly piqued my interest in terms of philosophy and philosophical thinking. My own personal background has more or less sort of weaved through the world of psychology, and just thinking about sort of the linkages between our respective disciplines is really what sort of spun off and started to think about this seminar series. So philosophy being thinking about thinking, and psychology being about, well, what are the mechanisms of thinking and how does that work? And then sort of bringing these two together to see if we could develop some frameworks, some heuristics to help us understand how we think about complexity. So today, Andrea is going to be talking about categorizations and its discontent. And categorization might seem like quite a boring topic when you look at it sort of at a surface level, but as Andrea will show, when you start digging into this, it actually gets really, really interesting and quite kind of nuanced and, for lack of a better word, quite complex. So I'm going to hand it over to Andrea. Just if you have any questions, just some housekeeping throughout, and you worry you're going to forget what the question is, just type it in the chat box. I'm happy to read it out when we get to question time. And then by the end of the meeting, if you have any questions, you can use your raise hand function. I have to say, though, that on occasion that functionality hasn't worked for me because for some reason in my Zoom, the hand raise function, I can't see the icons. So if you get frustrated and you feel like, I've risen my hand and I'm not responding, just briefly unmute your mic and just tell me, look, I have a question, and then we will get to you. And then, yes, we'll spend the next 55 minutes sort of on this. Over to you, Andrea.
Okay, thanks, Anton. All right, so the first thing I do want to do is just express my sorrow about the Cape Town fire and wish strength to everyone who was affected by that. It affected our speaker for this afternoon, so I'm actually stepping in place of the speaker that we advertised, who was Morin Peter. We're very eager to hear from him, so we will try to reschedule his talk as soon as he's ready to do it. Perhaps it's also, to some extent, our schedule is about learning to live with uncertainty. So it's actually changed quite dramatically from when I first sent it out. So one thing I'd like to do just before I start is invite anybody who is here and maybe feels like they have a voice that they'd like to be heard, material that they'd like to present. If you do have anything like that, just email me. You never know. There's always seems to be ins and outs, openings, closings in a schedule in a seminar like this, and maybe that kind of openness is part of what it means to live in a world that is complex. Okay, so what I want to do with this talk is just to kick off by acknowledging, well, actually, first of all, I suppose I should actually give you some pictures to look at. Again, in case the philosophy becomes a little bit too dense, well, philosophy, psychology, then at least you can look at pictures. So let's share the screen there. There we go. Okay, so I want to kick off by acknowledging that categorization is this huge and highly technical topic in both philosophy and psychology. But in everyday life, we mostly just do it out of necessity and without thinking at all. And this is what I want to open up here for reflection. Just some of the things we tend to do at an everyday level when we categorize. So very roughly, to begin with, we can't deal well with the amorphous input coming from a multitude of different elements in actual reality. And that's often encountered as continuums. So to negotiate our way around with a kind of degree of certainty, a degree of predictability or expectation, we need to arrange the massive raw material of information we encounter into clear-cut sections, definite categories that our brains can cope with. Now, within what Edgar Morin, or Morin, French pronunciation, calls a paradigm of simplicity, this categorization of even complicated phenomena can be relatively clear-cut and unproblematic. These are Anton's examples. The periodic table of elements is one of our most powerful tools, and its distinctions aren't all that troublesome. And also throughout history, some categories have been accurately and clearly defined and still remain really useful and poisonous versus edible mushrooms. So it's roughly when we face complex phenomena with kind of social and philosophical elements, we try to divide these into clear-cut categories, that categorization becomes an ambivalent and problematic cognitive tool. I mean, this is fairly difficult to accept for various reasons. We're very accustomed to categorization success within the paradigm of simplicity. We assume our tools can be transposed quite smoothly onto complex phenomena, and we tend to just gloss over those failures. And second, the complex phenomena of everyday life have already been divided into categories by someone long before we were born. I mean, into nations, religious and political affiliations, racial groups, grade scales in education, you name it. Well, how did these historical figures know precisely where to draw the lines, to draw accurate lines, to divide complex phenomena into these categories we've inherited? Well, you know, they didn't. And they couldn't have. No matter with what degree of certainty some of these have been passed on through schooling, for example. So like it or not, though, when it comes to complex phenomena, categorization entangles us in immense difficulties. So that's why I'm kind of shamelessly borrowing from Freud for the title of this presentation. Categorization, just like the self-restriction needed for social life, is both necessary and a source of intractable discontents. And I'm just going to put 5 of these discontents on the table for consideration. 2 things first, I'm certainly not going to suggest any kind of alternative to categorization for complex phenomena. But I do think it's important to start unpacking the troubles that complex phenomena make for categorization so that we can sidestep some of its more egregious kind of traps. Second, this is a very much a entry-level discussion. It's mostly derived from an engagement with Kevin Dutton's black and white thinking, and I'm sure that there's plenty more to consider. So this is an open invitation to comment now, perhaps, but also you know, later on after the seminar. Very open to suggestions. So for us, the first categorization error that I'd like to talk about anyway is the impossibility of knowing where to draw the lines. The Psaritis Paradox is a kind of a graphic way of showing that we cannot know precisely where to draw accurate lines that divide up a continuum. It pretty much goes like this. Most of us would readily grant that there's a recognizable difference between a heap of sand and a non-heap. We know a heap and we know a non-heap when we see them. We can point to a heap of sand and we can point to a large body of sand that's not a heap. So, well, what's the problem then? Clearly, a single grain of sand doesn't constitute a heap. The addition of 1 grain of sand is too small to make a difference to the statement. So 2 grains of sand also don't make a heap. There's a principle at work here. A grain of sand is just too small to make a difference concerning the status of a non-heap. So the addition of 1 grain of sand to a non-heap will never make it a non-heap. And the principle also works obviously in the other direction. The subtraction of 1 grain of sand from a heap can never cause it to lose its character as a heap. So if this principle holds, then you can keep adding 1 grain of sand to those in a non-heap forever, and you will never make a heap. And similarly, if you start out with a heap of sand, you can keep taking 1 grain of sand away forever without it ever becoming a non-heap, even when there's only 1 grain of sand left. So something's clearly wrong. If it just comes down to adding or subtracting grains of sand, there just doesn't seem to be a justifiable way of drawing an accurate dividing line between a heap and a non-heap. Maybe you can just decide that, well, 20 grains of sand makes a heap. Remember, just decide. But what if I just then take 1 grain of sand away? Well, since 1 grain of sand doesn't make a difference, why would you all of a sudden now have a non-heap? Couldn't 19 grains just as well make a heap? Okay, so I think you can think of the Psaritis Paradox as a metaphor for the discontent associated with the division of complex continuums into clear-cut categories. Just apply its principles to the abortion debate, for example, to get a sense of the depth of the problem. When exactly does a non-human become a human baby? By the same token, just because you don't know where to draw the boundary line doesn't mean to say that the crucial differences, such as differences between cells and babies or children and adults, don't exist. So a fundamental kind of principle of complexity emerges from this. Where to draw the lines in a continuum is never a matter of accurate knowledge. It's always a matter of decision. I mean, we could now follow Derrida, and we really should, maybe later on, follow Derrida into the intricacies of decision as a concept. Just very quickly, if you're able to gather complete knowledge in a situation, then you can merely make a calculation, and a decision is not necessary. A decision must be made when there's no possibility of complete knowledge, where your decision changes the conditions that make it necessary in the first place. And decisions, because of that, have significant practical effects and ethical consequences. What becomes possible, obviously, for those that fall on one side of a decisive line is denied to those that fall on the other side. That's just one example. So obviously then we're suggesting, I guess, that these continuous feedback loops between decisions, outcomes, revised decisions is an incredibly important principle of complexity. And many difficulties would result when we rigidly stick to decisions that were made in the past, as if they were written on stone. So, I mean, given the ethical importance of the decisive action we need to take to divide complex phenomena into categories, the question comes, well, then how? How best? How most optimally or how most ethically do we do this? What categorization tools do we actually have in our toolbox? And this leads to our second categorization, discontent, and that would be disjunctions among our primordial categorization tools. So here, I mean, if you think about evolutionary psychologists, they talk of a basic primordial categorization tools that are geared towards ensuring human survival. And from what I've read so far, we work with 3 basic categorization tools that divide the world into non-threat, threat, us, them, right, wrong. To divide the world at the most primary level here into threat, non-threat, it's quite complex, but to do this, we're predisposed towards recognizing species level sameness. In other words, the most basic form of categorization for humans is the recognition of a significant difference between humans, which are seen as a source of safety, and non-humans, which are seen as a threat. Category of non-human is further recognized on the basis of better wrong than dead, as divided between predator, evoking kind of externalizing defensive response associated with pain, fight and flight, or prey, evoking kind of integrating, internalizing response associated with pleasure. It's the response that says, bring it in, eat it up. So that would be our first level of categorization. At a second level, we're predisposed towards social behavior, which means recognizing intraspecies difference. We're social animals, and primordial humans, this is very rough, but lived in groups to promote opportunities for survival, reproduction. So group formation is necessarily the formation of kind of cohesive bonds. I'd say bonds of love if you want to. And we're especially sensitively attuned to coalitions and alliances within group settings. We tend towards in-group favoritism, and we're territorial. Also, group size is really important. If primordial groups were too small, people couldn't defend one another. If they got too big, cohesion loosens and breakaway formations would occur and new groups form. Now, since we create territorial boundaries, conflicts over territory would precipitate migrations into other territories, and environmental pressures in new territories create differences in outward appearance. And all of those factors create conditions for categorization in terms of group sameness. Intraspecies difference, obvious differences in outward appearance is one of those shortcuts that we are predisposed towards using. And then, as we've heard in our previous seminars, very much socialized and habituated into using. And we use it for quick categorization of insider, outsider, or us, them. So here's the beginnings of this discontent. These two basic tools of categorization were both necessary for survival, but they're in unresolvable tension or conflict with one another. When coming face to face with any unknown person, we sit with a dilemma. Which do we prioritize? Species level sameness or in-group sameness? So at a third level, we are predisposed to categorize in terms of right and wrong. And this is assumed to have developed as a tool to manage conflicts, both within groups to kind of safeguard the integrity of the group as they increase in size due to agriculture, other technological changes, and between groups, because you want some kind of procreative cross-pollination, and this demands prioritization of sameness as a species level. So our discontent just deepens because it doesn't look like our sense of right and wrong can help us resolve conflict between whether to prioritize species sameness, we are all human, or group sameness, us against them. So admittedly, this is a question, but we have drafted various charters on human rights, which at least try to address this conflict. But if we take the vaccination chauvinism as just one example among many, it looks like we have three very basic categorization tools geared towards survival, and they don't work together in a coherent, orderly system. Yet our capacity for survival does seem undisputed. Or is it? I'm not sure of this. I'm opening it out as a question to you. I'd kind of like to talk about it. But could we argue that the disjunction in our basic cognitive toolbox is responsible for the global threats to all life that we're facing currently? It's just a question. I'm putting it to you. Okay, so the third discontent that we can set up on the table for discussion is the impossibility of accurately selecting criteria for decision making. I mean, many pressing problems of categorization involve a kind of abstract component that's notoriously hard to define. For example, the philosophical designation of what it means to be an adult. And yet, these problems of categorization require, or sometimes seem to require, a distinct, definite distinction between categories. So think of the continuum that constitutes maturation in humans. You know, add 1 second of life's experience to a person's life, and it makes no difference to their level of maturity and capacity to engage in adult activities. Say to tolerate alcohol or engage in consensual sex. But there was a singular split on a particular birthday where on one side of the split, the person would be too immature to engage in adult activities. And on the other side of the split, the activities would be legally permissible. So from one side of the split to the other, there's no noticeable change in maturity levels. The question of how best, how most optimally, how most ethically to divide this maturation continuum into age levels, into categories that constitute criminal versus non-criminal behavior has been answered very differently in different historical eras and in different cultures. And consensus has never been reached because there just is no justifiable way of drawing an accurate dividing line between a child and an adult in that sense. It's a matter of decision. So on what criteria does one make these decisions? To return to Psaritis and the heap non-heap conundrum, the problem of where to draw the boundary line between categories cannot ever be resolved using just one feature or criterion. I mean, that makes sense. Number of grains or number of seconds lived out is just not enough. So it's essential to consider multiple features along with number of grains. So if you think about a heap, you could, I mean, if you're just thinking about sand, you could consider, I don't know, degree of connection, the stickiness of the sand. If conditions are damp, the grains might stick together more, heap might form more easily. If they're dry, might not form a heap. Different kinds of materials. Are these grains of rice, sand, pebbles, potatoes, carrots, corpses? I imagine 3 grains of sand would not form a heap, but 3 corpses might. Spatial orientation, many grains that are widely distributed in space cannot form a heap, but fewer grains close together might. Relative comparison to other heaps. What is a heap among heaps? That might not be the same in cross kind of heap comparison, if you want to say that, or into subjective agreement. Do we all concur on what we even mean by a heap? So fine, even if you use multiple criteria, the discontent associated with the problem of knowledge persists. There's no strict guidelines to help us make knowledgeable, accurate choices regarding which features count, which to ignore, which differences make a difference, in what context, under whose authority. So again, categorization in this case remains a matter of judicious decision-making. And this leads to a kind of a fourth discontent. Categorization styles form a kind of a meta-level continuum. I'm going to unpack it along the lines of the term inclusivity, but just with the reminder that the term exclusivity is completely intimately bound with it as a kind of inversely related counterpart. So the more inclusive, the less exclusive. So you could also use the term exclusivity, but just for simplicity's sake, in a way, I'm just going to unpack it along the continuum of inclusivity. So broadly, basically, infants begin with inclusive, broad brush categories. And with maturity and experience, we make ever more fine-grained distinctions. So another question that I want to pose to you and maybe to the educators, is there an appropriate age then to introduce complexity thinking to humans? Is there an appropriate age where we can make subtle differences and nuances and gradations that inform judicious decision-making? Just a question. I don't know an answer to that yet. But the discontent that we face in this respect is that we regularly seem to err on either side of over-inclusive and under-inclusive categorization styles. So, bearing in mind we're speaking about a continuum, we can say that an over-inclusive style of categorization tends towards universalism, where all category members belong because they are the same. The differences are not significant and all members have an equal status. So this kind of broad brush inclusive categorization is efficient in some contexts. An official, for instance, managing a queue for car license renewal might see all applicants as the same in significant features. All are equally entitled to apply for a license and must follow the same procedures and rules. And a strict manager will treat all people in this category in the same way, showing no preferences, no nepotism, no favoritism, no special concessions. But the manager will also make no nuanced, fine-grained, differential value judgments regarding special needs, urgency, that kind of thing. So looked at in this way, inclusive, broad brush categorization now risks kind of a harmful over-inclusivity, where you include too many members in too few categories that are defined too broadly to be appropriate for the context. So in most queuing contexts, there are concessions, think about airport queues, that do not include the old and the infirm in the category of people who must obey all the rules. The most serious disorder, though, associated with over-inclusive categorization is the kind of stereotyping where the tendency to focus on sameness and ignore individual differences doesn't work to ensure equally distributed fair treatment of all category members, but imposes a kind of equally distributed unfair judgment that includes all category members. So just as all people in a car licensing queue are all the same, so all Muslims are extremists, all Westerners are capitalists, all men are rapists, and so it goes on and on. So the contrasting under-inclusive style of categorization has the benefit of sensitivity to fine-grained subtleties in difference. But its discontents then lie in the tendency to include too little in a proliferation of strictly and narrowly defined categories. So on the one hand, categories become so specific that they can include only a select few, running the risk of exclusive essentialism. It's another form of stereotyping. On the other hand, this process of ongoing differentiation and category refinement creates so many categories with so few exclusive, specifically defined members that it turns upon itself, becoming an unwieldy instrument that defies the principal aim of categorization, which is to make life easier to negotiate. So you might want to consider the massive array of categories into which you could sort your movie or music collection, or Facebook's notorious 70-something categories for gender identification. At the most extreme, hoarding represents an extreme version of kind of under-inclusive categorization style. So faced with a sorting problem, hoarders are paralyzed by the inability to form categories because they only see uniquely individual things, all at the same level, all equally important, and they can't decide what to discard. So in sum, the fourth discontent is this: over-inclusive and under-inclusive styles seem to turn upon themselves at some point and work against what they were initially intended to achieve. Question is this inevitable? Or would it help us in some way to try to work out a way of assessing exactly the right amount of inclusivity for a context? Not sure of this. Again, it's a question I'm putting to you. Could we find a generally accepted midpoint, a happy medium, or a golden mean of optimal inclusivity or optimal category size in a way for a particular context? Or is erring on one side or the other of this inclusivity over under inclusivity divide inevitable? This is what Derrida would suggest, that there is no such thing as a happy medium. It's a question that I'd like to pursue further, but something I'd like to put out to you to think about. But also, before even trying to answer those questions, it's worth considering that they might just evaporate if we shift away from this Aristotelian model of categorization, to which the categorization discontents of over and under seem to be quite intimately tied. Classical model is based on definition, very quick. Something is defined as having specific features which all have equal status as essential, and for anything to belong to the category, it must have those features. So if, for example, very simple, but if, for example, to be a bird, you need feathers, a beak, and the ability to fly, well, then you sit with the problem of anomalous creatures like the penguin or ostrich. And to include all of the anomalous creatures, you make your category too big to be useful. But to make new categories for all of the anomalies leaves you with this unwieldy multitude of categories. So would there be a way to revise the very way that in which categorization works? Okay, so if one of the things that Kevin Dutton points out is that when investigating color perception, Eleanor Roche empirically kind of confirmed something different about the process of categorization. Just a brief explanation. So color perception is produced by 3 dimensions: hue, saturation, brightness. Hue is the color itself, saturation, how light or dark it is, and brightness, saturation, how dull or vivid it is. But everything about color perception sits on a continuum. All hues shade into one another, leaving us points at which this kind of mixture of hues is so equal that it's really impossible to say whether the color is a yellow or a red. And on top of that, colors range along these unbroken continuums of brightness and saturation. But okay, so what Roche's experiments revealed is that we're far more struck by and remember better quite a limited set of color shades where there's a high level of hue, brightness, and saturation. And these high levels of all 3 converge. And these color shades are seen as better examples of a given color category than others. So this is according to Roche. There's usually a single red, a little bit different sometimes from person to person, but that tops personal rankings of the best possible example of red. That would be the prototype. You see on this color chart, there's only one color called red. The rest are sort of either warm red or they're just numbers. So the idea would be that the further away a red is from that prototype, the less good it is as an example of that color category. Question, can we read the prototype model of categorization or can that model solve some of the discontents associated with over and under inclusivity? And if you think about a prototype model, you could perhaps have a highly inclusive, large single category called reds or birds. But some reds or birds would be better examples of that category. That way you can sort of integrate exclusivity into inclusivity. Is this less structured, more versatile kind of prototype model more appropriate for dealing with complex phenomena? Maybe, it's a question to ask. What I do want to point out, though, is it carries an extremely dangerous risk of a kind of unwitting value slip from being a good or bad example of a certain thing to being a good or bad thing. The slip is insidious and it's subtle, because it derives from a completely habitual, long-term, historical association of the true, the beautiful, and the good. So I want you to consider just text. This is what happens in Kevin Dutton's discussion of Roche's ideas. And these are citations from his text. Roche presented them with a polychromatic mix of world-class, I don't know if you can see that here, world-class color exemplars. Example, pillar box red, along with some shoddy, substandard alternatives, the red on the inside of a watermelon, that coral kind of color. He takes loud, shouty yellow and hot, brutal red, which might not really seem positive attributes in themselves, but he takes them and he makes them positive by associating them with the super capitals of the color world, he says, the Londons, the New Yorks, the Beijings, the cities on the color map that never sleep. And these are contrasted with the more dreary, less vibrant, less happening color suburbs. The Zone 1 inner city concrete jungle blues are contrasted with dormitory, commuter, suburban blues. Same vein, the prototype shades, the genuine articles, the pillar box reds and the Cokes can reds again, are contrasted with the counterfeits and the cheap imitations. So these are the watermelon corals and the russet reds, you know, the oranges and the pinks. Again, yellowness of a lemon, the beautiful yellowness of a lemon is contrasted with the yellowness of a fading bruise, or the West End shamrock and downtown emerald. It's contrasted with small town snot greens. So what I want you to note here is how easily this discourse has slipped into this habitual confluence of the good, the true, and the beautiful. And this probably matters little in a light-hearted kind of text about color. But Dutton must, and he does, take the next logical step. And this is also a citation. This doesn't just apply to colors. The same could be said of anything. And this is where the slip becomes problematic. And it makes me wonder whether prototype categorization is a suitable answer to the discontents of classical categorization, not only because it equally risks a kind of essentialist stereotyping, but it's also so vulnerable to this habitual value slip between being a good or bad example, which is one thing, of a kind of thing, to being a good or bad thing. Okay, so to sum up, it seems impossible really to get away from the fact that we have to artificially divide up complex, continuous reality into categories to work with it. If we don't do this, we'll go crazy. But there just does not seem to be a fail-safe categorization tool for doing this. And then maybe our only recourse is to learn how to select tools with an awareness of the things they do and of the dangerous discontents that they present. And this, for me, requires an education that I think has a lot more to do with an ethical and emotional education as opposed to a knowledge-based education. I mean, or maybe you need all three together. These are the questions that I have raised in my mind while I've been reading a bit about categorization. That is it from me now. I hope that the talk has left you with as many questions as I still have. But yes, okay, thank you. Let me get back to reality.
Thanks, Andrea. Very interesting. We have a lot of questions already in the chat, but I was wondering if there's anybody who wanted to voice a question before I start reading out anything. Anybody would like to just unmute their mic and ask Andrea a direct question?
I'd quite like to ask a question directly rather than via the chat, if that's okay.
Please go ahead.
Yes, Andrea, that was wonderful and a very clear, very interesting, and a really beautiful way of thinking about this issue of complex continuums. My kind of additional thought was, and this comes from complexity theory thinking, so using the word complexity in a particular way, I guess, which is about the focus in complexity of seeing reality, of seeing the world as the kind of emergence, stabilizing and then dissolving of patterns. So it's an episodic worldview that's about kind of how things create patterns together, and it's not a continuum. So of course the examples you gave, and they're very good examples, are of continuums, you know, when is there one more grain of sand. But sometimes our decision making is aided by, for example, a forest or an ecology emerges locally. Now there's still some subjectivity about where is the end of the forest, but it's because it's not a continuum. It's kind of easier to say, well, it's kind of about there, and you know, there are no trees in this field, and it's still, you know, slightly vague, and those bluebells seem to have wandered into the area slightly out of where the trees are, and there's some new trees growing just along the edges. But it has more, we are aided with this kind of patterning in the world in some situations in terms of decision making. So that, yeah, so that I just wanted to add in that it's the same about what is my nuclear family. You know, we'd have some arguments about grandma maybe, you know, but it would be, you know, it would be, you know, reasonably but you know, it would be reasonably understandable, and we would know you weren't in my family. It wouldn't be contentious. So I just wondered about adding into what you were doing that through the lens of patterning and systemic whole making, how, you know, it's a big question, but how would that weave into this kind of thinking? So
what is striking me is that it might give us a very nice way of thinking about how it is that we know when a heap is a heap and when a beach is a beach, and that there is a kind of complex patterning that allows us to operate even though those boundaries are not certain. So yes, I think that to me seems like a very interesting area so a very helpful way of trying to think about why it is that we can function reasonably well anyway, despite the fact that we don't have very strict boundaries. Maybe we don't need them that much. I mean, there's certain conditions in which we do. I think, like, when is something murder and when isn't it? Where is a forest not really a forest anymore and still a field? It would matter, I suppose, if there's ownership of the land involved or something legal. But yes, yeah, I think in a way, no complex system has any kind of definite boundaries, and yet we still work with them very productively. So thinking along the lines of these kind of complex systems gives one an excellent and wonderful tool to start maybe negotiating some of these. That's what I would think, just off the top of my head. It sounds like
if I could just come back briefly, there's kind of in the outer world, so to speak, there are some things that are definitely continuums, yeah. And there are some things that are systemic. So that because they're interwoven and integrative, they do present themselves in the world differently. Equally, in our inner world, in our inner sense making, there's a kind of interweaving of notions, you know, do I like it here is partly a social, partly an economic, partly political, you know, those things interweave. So we have this kind of interweaving of patterning in our inner, which obviously plays out in our outer. So I just wonder whether we need to differentiate between things that are truly continuums and things that are episodic. So.
Yes, yes. Okay, thank you. Yes, I agree. I think that will make an excellent kind of addition to, yeah, and I think you're absolutely right about that. Yeah. Okay, thanks. Thanks very much. Yeah.
Very good. Any other questions that anybody has that they'd like to speak? Just feel free to unmute your mic.
Sure. Andrea, thanks for a really interesting discussion. That was great. And I'm wondering if what you are identifying is a feature and not a bug of being human, by which I mean, I think we've got two ways of thinking about complexity. One is as a method and one is as a philosophy. When it's a method, it's a way of modeling the world, right? It's and we think of it as a superior way of modeling the world to more mechanistic structures or some other way of thinking about things. It's been very useful in that sense. But what if we ourselves are in the midst of the complexity? In other words, what if we are not standing back from it, able to use it as a method, but rather embedded within it? And what that would suggest then, it seems to me, is that we have a finite ability of foresight. We are faced with things that overtax our consciousness at all times. And therefore, what we're doing at all times is creating a way to make it through the world. And, you know, we talk about autopoiesis, we talk about emergence, we talk about all of those sorts of things. And so what you're identifying, it seems to me, is opportunities for that emergence to happen. In other words, when we're faced with those ambiguities and that vagueness, now we are called to, or called back to our humanness, called back to the question of, okay, how do I be human in this moment? How do I actually respond to this ambiguity in a matter that is not just the way a computer would do it? And so I'm wondering if what you're identifying is something very integral to who we are and not simply a kind of puzzle to be overcome.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. Yes, definitely. It's, I mean, these discontents, I kind of call them discontents rather than disorders, just to kind of take from Freud that idea that this is something that is necessary to being human, even though it produces these conundrums and these impossibilities. So I'm absolutely with you that this is the human condition. The two things that come out from what you're talking about is, again, I think tied to this moment of decision. It's a concept that one needs to explore in a lot more detail, because part of the human condition is to make decisions in a situation in which we do not have enough knowledge, we do not have enough time to gather the knowledge. Even if we had enough time, we wouldn't be able to do it. A decision must be made about a crucially important aspect of our living, and we don't have the computer-like way of being that could actually turn this, as Derrida says, into a mere calculation. So we have to make a decision, and that's part of what we have to be trained in order to be able to do. So all of these discontents associated with categorization are also discontents associated with making decisions. We need to know what they are, I think. And I don't know if these 5 are the only ones. They're just the ones that kind of struck me while I was reading a book. But so there may well be many more of them. But we need to kind of be aware of their kind of their pros and cons, their dangers, so that when we make a decision, which we have to do, even though we can't make a perfect decision, a right decision, we don't know, therefore we decide. And then again, we have to kind of think about the finitude and the humanness of that moment when you make that decision. And then the other concept that ties to that, that came out from, I think, what both of you were saying, is this concept of emergence, is that once you've made that decision to configure something, you actually reconfigure the landscape, which made the decision necessary in the first place. There's no going back. Once you've made that decision, things change. And then you have to rethink your decision. So it's an ongoing kind of process. And I think that is part of what the complexity of being in this world is that there are no kind of definite, final, absolute guardrails to hold on to. And so, yes, thank you for that. I think it is definitely, I want to make absolutely clear that this is part of the uncertainty and difficulty of the human condition, and we'll never be able to remedy it in the sense of making it all better. It's not something we can fix. It's something we have to live with. Okay, thanks.
Good. Sort of in tying in with what you were talking about, the troublesomeness of categories, Mario had a comment that he added in the chat, and he said, I wonder how we can connect this to the tragedy of the commons as treated by Ostrom, the Nobel Prize winner in economics. He says this lies at the heart of our climate change problems regarding collaboration across categories of nationhood, like global south, global north, or developed versus developing countries. Do you think that that's a good example of sort of where categorization becomes troublesome?
Sorry, Anton, could you just repeat that? I sort of, sorry, I just absolutely lost track halfway.
No worries. Unfortunately, Mario had to leave. Otherwise, I would have encouraged him to ask the question himself. But he was just wondering if this whole idea of tragedy of the commons is something that I suppose how exemplified by this problematic, the problematic nature of categorization. So he says, does this lie at the heart of our climate change problems regarding collaboration across categories of nationhood, like global south, global north, or the developed or the developing world?
Maybe. I think what I'm going to have to ask, it's such a huge question. But yes, I think if you think about if you think about the initial, I mean, this is the question that I suppose I posed that is what I am associating with now, is the possibility that we have ways of categorization that include human as a whole. We are all human. We belong to that category. It's an inclusive category. And then we have that second mode of categorization, which actually divides us into in-group, out-group. So that would be north, south, all of that. And these two very, very, very fundamental modes of categorization will never be able to become compatible. We can't make them work together. They work against one another. And there isn't our third mode. There isn't an ethical mode that could actually make it possible for those two categories to kind of work in tandem. That I have to say I'm posing as a question. I might be a very kind of, what shall we say this, a fairly negative style of being that doesn't see the possibility of those two things working together. But there might well be a complexity solution. So I'm going to that potential conundrum. Maybe an evolution of the way that we think towards complexity could help us negotiate the very opposing pulls between a global kind of, we are in this together, we need to work together at a universal kind of level, or we are divided into us and them, and we have in-group favoritism and the rest don't count as much. I mean, if you think about this vaccination chauvinism that's happened, you know, one doesn't have hope sorry, let me put this onto, I mean, I feel like I'm being very kind of doomsday here, but I'm finding it difficult to find how one would actually enable us to think in a way that resolves that.
Gary has asked a few questions. I'm going to ask him to unmute his mic and maybe just speak them out if you don't mind, Gary. But one of the things he mentions here is the test of categorization, not its usefulness. And just before you answer that, Andrea, I would just say, Gary, that it depends on who decides what is useful. I'm sure that the people who the nationalist government of the apartheid state would have said racial categorization was very useful for their agenda, but of course not so useful for many millions of other people. So that's just my 2 cents on that. Andrea, do you have anything to say to that? And Gary, please feel free to chime in and ask more questions.
So, I mean, usefulness, not usefulness, is also a category, and one makes a decision about what belongs to this category, what doesn't. So, yeah, usefulness would be very tricky, as you say. No, I'm in agreement with you there. But let's hear from Gary.
Yeah, thanks, Anton. Thanks, Andrea. Yeah, I mean, I think Andrea's input is fascinating. I mean, I'm going to work it into my PhD stuff. So, but you know, but it's this human being in a place where they have to make pragmatic choices about how things work. You know, and I think that's what categorization is about. Is the, you know, the line charging down the pathway at you. You have to make some very quick decisions about the threat to you as an individual, and if you don't, you get eaten. You know, I mean, that's the nub of it. You know, but I was just earlier to your point, Andrea, about survival. I think humans are more that it goes further than Maslow's sort of hierarchy. Is that we're into his top category, the actualization, is that we're also about thrival. We want to drive BMWs, not just drive a car, you know. And I think that's what drives our overindulgence in a whole bunch of things, and that's what's created this tragedy of the commons, is that we can't pull back to just basic requirements. We go further than that. Yeah, but I mean, this categorization, and I think the patterning is the other one, is that they live together, is that humans use those tools to make their way through this world in a way that works for them. You know, and when you have this clash, then it comes down to a power thing. But you know, in terms of the climate change thing, the North and the South is a very useful categorization, but that's but what is the South? You know, what is the global South? It's very different. Yeah. So, you know, thanks.
Okay. So 2 things that are coming out for me, and we're going to have to, there are 2 people with hands up, I see, but so quickly with Gary, 2 things that we really have to discuss and think about is desire. You know, speak for yourself if you want to drive a BMW. I'm highly happy with my Monty Almero, who's now done 230,000 kilometers, and I'm very fond of her. so desire, yes, that's an incredibly important aspect of what you were talking about. And I have to admit, I've lost the other one. Can't remember what it was, but I will listen again to and note it again. But I would like to, there are 2 people with their hands up. One is Duarte. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name right at all. And then the other one is Koshik. And maybe we should chat to both of you, and then we might have to finish up after those 2.
Yes. So please go ahead, Duarte.
Thanks. I'm new to the group, and I'm really fascinated by the conversation. And thank you for that. Not being a philosopher, I wouldn't have thought about these topics on a good day. But I have some thoughts and some questions. And so what I'm hearing in this conversation and the whole notion of complexity is that somehow we must make a decision, and that some of the important aspects of these decisions are being ethical, you know. And for me, there's more to this. You know, it's about, so the mode is of knowing. And what about the mode of feeling? You know, is that of lesser value? I looked at your color spectrum there, and I'm a photographer, and use color to convey emotion. I'm not trying to tell you anything about category. And so it seems to me like there's a predisposition to knowing. And I, you know, like I say, perhaps you're a philosopher and that's an important thing for you, but I want to highlight the mode of being. Then I experience things and I can't speak them, because the problem is if I have to speak them, I have to put categories. My words are categories. They constrain. There's meaning, in meaning and out of meaning. And I frame things based on how I think. And so, you know, my thoughts about this topic was that there's a link between the cognition and language, that some words are more inclusive than others, and it's which words we choose. I mean, in the work I do, I spend a lot of time talking to people about the words they choose, because sometimes the words they choose create problems for themselves and complexity that they didn't need just based on the words they chose. So I wonder, you know, what are your thoughts about that? And then also the other implied thing is that this is about conscious thinking. That, you know, it's only in conscious thinking that we make categories. And what about the unconscious mind? And how does that relate to your categorization problem? So I'm just giving you a couple of other dimensions, because I mean, complexity is always about looking at it from different perspectives. Keen thoughts on that.
Thank you. I mean, I don't have, like, what, 3 months, but I see from all the comments that are coming in the chat thing that your artist colleagues, your music colleagues are saying, yeah, good going, good point. Yes, absolutely. So absolutely, I think that the prioritization of knowledge in a kind of a complexity thinking paradigm must be questioned. I think that's incredibly important. The idea of different layers and levels and modes of being in the world, essential, and hoping that we will generate conversations about these in further seminars. Those are extremely important points. So I think all I can really say very quickly to you is yes, we'll listen again, I think, look at the questions. It will be on YouTube, the discussion, and bring out a whole lot of those points and try to generate further discussion on exactly those points. I think it does have to become much more than about philosophical knowledge. Not that philosophy always is so hell-bent on finding knowledge. A lot of times it's more about insight than about knowledge. So I think absolutely. Thank you. Yes. Kaushik, just quickly, let's hi, nice to meet you as well.
Thanks, Andrea, and it's lovely to be here. It's my first time, so it's an enjoyable conversation. And you know, I'd like to agree with you, Andrea. I think there's the complexity is the result of these cognitive biases that you've highlighted. We are ever present and forever building. But you know, there's complexity as human beings. There's also complexity in the natural system. I think we haven't quite understood how to understand those in a way in which brings about a better human being or better natural system. So yeah, I'm built to have a talk to you guys. So I'll try and build that in when I speak to you soon, I hope.
Excellent. Yes, it will be next Friday, if you are able to. I know the Cape Town fire might have affected you too, but yeah, chat to me by email. I would very much, love to hear much more about what you have to say.
Okay, well, sadly, we won't be able to get to all of the questions today. Mark posed some questions in the chat, and as well as some others. Unfortunately, we are already well over time. and I'm going to call it to a close. But as Andrea mentioned, this is an ongoing conversation. This is not something that you know, we necessarily have all the answers to, nor is this sort of the end of this by any means. So I'm going to say goodbye to everybody. If you want to sort of make yourself visible and just wave goodbye to everybody, that'd be nice. See the faces of all the attendees. It's very good. Ivo, Sharon. Great. Wonderful. Okay, everyone. Thanks, Andrea. Bye.
Pleasure. Okay. Thank you. Bye.